Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with my first World Cup video. This will be my detailing of my team selection and my first draft here. Keep in mind, of course, that in this World Cup Fantasy game mode, you don't really have the updated players yet. There are some players who've been selected for the World Cup who haven't been included in the game and don't have prices right now. At the same time, you'll also see that people who are involved in the game and included aren't actually going to the World Cup. A good example is someone like Renato Sanchez, who's priced at 8.5 million as a midfielder for Portugal, but he's not heading with the team towards Qatar. And to start off with the team selection, I'll actually look at the forwards because I think these are the best players right now that you can pick. You also have captaincy options for them. And unlike FPL, you get the option to change your captaincy once within one match day. One match day means all the group stage games, the kind of first round robin for all teams. And that includes games that actually start from the 20th of November towards the 24th of November. So you actually get to change your captaincy once in between that whole stage. So you can maybe go for a Messi captaincy early and then move it to someone like a Neymar captaincy or even a Kane captaincy or maybe even a Benzema or Mbappe captaincy if you like. You can only change your captain once and therefore you have two captaincy options each match day. But keep in mind, of course, who your first captain is and who your substitute captain is. And therefore, we probably just need at least 2 to 3 premiums to choose between so we can make the right selection there with the captaincy. I do think the forwards are actually better. You all obviously have Kevin De Bruyne as one of the top midfield options, but I really think he shouldn't be considered compared and contrasting to some of the other players who actually have better group stages, have, I would say, a much more solid team and are probably better talismans when it comes to actually getting consistent goals for their teams. So to start off with the forward positions, I actually think Messi is an absolute lock for me, Neymar as well, and Kane. The reason why I've actually gone for all these three players and I've completely skipped out on one of the French forwards is because between Benzema and Mbappe, one of the interesting things is both of them are still fantastic players. Of course, Benzema, the recent Ballon d'Or winner, Mbappe probably in the best form when it comes to actually his clinical finishing, both in the Champions League and in Ligue 1. I would say, though, that Neymar and Messi do play similar roles for their teams where they are more talismans and less creative players compared to how they play on a domestic level. Because you'll see in PSG this season that Messi does play a little bit deeper. He does look for balls in behind for someone like Mbappe. Whereas for the Argentina national team, you can actually see that Messi actually formulates the bulk of their goals. He probably scores, I would say, 60 to 70% of their goals. You can see that in the recent matches where I think he scored 5 goals in 2 games. And simply put, this team is pretty much built to play around Messi. You can see also in the Copa America games that he is one of the players who's actually the deepest. He'll also look to make runs in behind at times, as well as drop deep. So he does play a very talismanic role for that team. And similar to Neymar, Neymar is someone who will play in the false nine or even striker position for this Brazilian team, specifically because Richarlison is probably still nursing himself back to full health with his injury. So that gives Neymar the position to conquer as a striker for me for this Brazilian team. And he also, similar to Messi, is an absolute talisman and does share with the bulk of goals, which is also why he's broken all the Brazilian national team records for goal scoring. Kane is someone who's found fantastic consistency within the Premier League. A lot of people will be looking at the plaudits that have gone Haaland's way, but if you look at Kane's record this year, it's been incredibly consistent, both in the Champions League and domestically in the Premier League. He's been very consistent, scoring from set pieces, scoring from penalties, scoring from simple situations where he is both the creative player for Spurs at times when he drops deep, but also the player who finds great goal scoring opportunities game to game, finding space in between the lines and combining with both Kulusevski and Son when they're available. And I would say for this English national team, you'll see, of course, that Sterling was one of the key players for the Euros, but Kane still shares a considerable amount of the goals. One thing, of course, with Kane is that I would say he probably had a rather average Euro performance, even though England made it very, very deep. However, I'm still expecting England to completely dominate their group, which means that Kane should share the bulk of the chances and most of the chances. And as we know, this England team has very technical players like Foden and Saka who will get penalties and Kane will be beneficiary of them. Whereas when you're picking between Benzema and Mbappe, I think the opportunities will be split, even though France actually have a fantastic group. It's very different to Neymar and Messi, who are both the talismans, the key match winners for their team and goal scorers as well. So that for me is a big difference and why I'm actually going to be skipping both on both Mbappe and Benzema for now. If we move on to the midfield position, I would actually like to go with some of my punts first. Trossard for me is an interesting punt. What I will say from the outset is that he is not expected to start immediately. He is someone who we probably might see play 20 to 30 minutes a game, and maybe over the course of the group stage could be a great punt. I also like the fact that Trossard is playing in a rather easy group for Belgium. We know that Belgium usually actually end up losing only to the big dogs in the tournament. For example, they lost to Italy in the Euros. They also lost to the eventual winner in France in the previous World Cup. They do have an age squad now. Hazard has gotten considerably worse as a player, hasn't shown any domestic form at all. and they have a very aged backline who are now covered by some very, very young recruits from the Belgian league themselves that haven't actually had much international experience. And that's going to be sort of transitional period that this Belgian team is on. De Bruyne is probably still the actual player in the peak of his powers, and I think that's the one interesting thing for Belgium, where Trossard is now waiting in the wings, hopefully where he can start as well for this team, because he's been such a great player in the Premier League and has showcased that for Brighton this year as they've found themselves within the midst of a qualification spot. And so Trossard is going to be my punt, but as I said, keep in mind he could be someone who just eventually comes 20 to 30 minutes a game. What's interesting though is if you look at some of the previous games that Belgium have played, they did absolutely destroy Poland 6-1 recently, where Trossard was able to come off the bench at around 65, 70 minutes and actually score a brace in that game. So that does show you that he still can get involved in these games and can be quite a big differential piece at a very, very cheap price of 5.5. If we move on to midfield picks, you have some defensive mid players. What's interesting about the midfield position in World Cup Fantasy and also Champions League Fantasy is you do get rewarded for defensive involvements in the game. So players who get ball recoveries and so on and so forth actually get a lot of points in the midfield position, in contrast to something like FPL where you're purely looking for clean sheets, purely looking for goals and assists. Someone like Bellingham, for me, is a dual-edged sword where he does a lot of defensive work, and you see that in the Champions League as well, where he gets a lot of ball recoveries, but is also in big games, I would say, someone who's a certain match winner and has that kind of attacking edge where he does look for a goal, does look for an assist. And even though he is only simply playing in a box-to-box position, I do think he's rather well priced at 7.5. You won't really have players who are cheaper than him who play that sort of role, because if you look at someone like Pedri, who is also a centre mid, he's really poorly priced in my opinion as an 8.5 million player who will be starting for Spain, but I would say probably has less of a defensive edge and isn't as exciting, I would say, as a Jude Bellingham just because of the price point. So Bellingham is someone who's immediately going into my team. And I also like him because I think he'll actually play most of the games for England, whereas I can't say the same between Foden and Saka. There will be rotation between them, and Sterling, of course, is sort of out of reach for me. Lautaro Martinez is someone you can absolutely consider if you're actually looking to downgrade in the forward positions and maybe looking to actually include De Bruyne into your teams. But it's not an option that I'm going to look at for now for my first draft. I much prefer going for Messi, Neymar, and Kane, and I'm pretty much set on these options for now. So Jude Bellingham does join my team. I'd also like to add someone like Bergwijn into my team. Within this Dutch setup, you have players like Gakpo, Depay, and Bergwijn to choose from between the attacking players, and I think Bergwijn is someone who has been very involved. He's nailed in this Dutch setup, and he's just not a forward, right? Depay and Gakpo, even though they're reasonably well priced, Depay being the penalty taker, Gakpo someone who's been involved in almost like a 10-like position, usually just almost like a left inside forward, finds a lot of goal scoring opportunities, and has been one of Netherlands' key players in the attack. Just seems to be someone who I wouldn't really touch purely because of the position. On the other hand, Bergwijn is also one of the key attackers of this team, has one of the most goal involvements for the Dutch national team, and is at the midfield position for a price of 7 million. So I would like to involve him in my setup. Another player that I think is absolutely essential is Leroy Sané. And Sané is interesting because you have some other comparatives here in this German national team setup. You have someone like Musiala who can come off the bench. But the one thing with Musiala, even though he's 8 million, 1 million cheaper than Sané, is he's not nailed. And I think Sané is going to be an interesting player playing almost like a forward for Germany with Timo Werner coming out. We know that this German national team setup don't actually have a plethora of forwards to employ. That's why Moukoko is someone who was brought into the national setup. But I think Sané will occupy a lot of offensive positions. And in contrast to someone like a Goretzka or a Kimmich, I don't think he'll be getting as many assists. So he's going to be someone who you look for to get the goals for this German national team, even though they have a slightly tougher group than most. So Sané is going to be my option where I think he will be a key player there. Another thing about Germany is because I simply think that they'll be a very offensive team. I will expect them to concede goals, but at the same time, they are very high-octane, high-press. You'll see in a game, for example, where they played versus Italy recently, where there was a plethora of chances for both teams, and it simply just shows that this German team, I think, aren't going to give much away when they're actually pushing to attack and pushing to score. So Sané is someone who they will absolutely rely on to actually get those goals. To actually round out my midfield setup, I'd actually like to pick a budget player, and the budget player that I'm actually going to go for is someone from Denmark. And within the Danish national team setup, you have someone like Skov Olsen, who is a top player for Denmark, who's actually been recently involved within the last 2 years. We didn't hear much of him in the Euros. Of course, the big player at the time was someone like Damsgaard, who we'll all remember for that fantastic free kick goal versus England, and just a general great run from him, starting from being a super sub in that team to actually starting in the game versus England. And what I like about Skov Olsen is he's come into this Danish setup and he's one of the leaders in goal involvement so far. So I do think he is someone who's absolutely worth bringing in. Just to actually balance your team, you need to have some budget players. You can't just pick big guns from every country. That's what a budget cap provides, and therefore Skov Olsen is someone you would like to look on. He's a little bit cheaper than Eriksson, sorry, much cheaper than Eriksson, at the same price as Damsgaard, but someone who I think will be much more involved and just simply has the form with his Danish national team, especially when you look at Damsgaard not even being a consistent option for Brentford. So that's going to be my pick there for a budget midfielder. And if we move on now to the defenders, for the defenders, I'd actually like to employ some players with some fantastic tournaments in the Euros as of late, and also who have just simply been involved with the national team setup since then. So we don't really have any kind of risk of rotation. These are all starting players for their teams, and I really think that they are the standout fullbacks to pick from. These are going to be Shaw from England, Mala from Denmark, and also Dumfries from the Netherlands. And the reason why I've gone for these players is because Dumfries and Shaw specifically have the most attacking edge. We saw, of course, Mala had a fantastic tournament for Denmark, but I think he has been a little bit quiet, of course, in the recent games for Denmark, where Shaw and Dumfries have continued to find that form on an international level. Shaw has reinserted himself back into the starting side of the Man United team, and Dumfries, of course, has been a consistent player for Inter as well, has also found some goals and assists this season for a Inter team that seemed to have dropped off a little bit of a level from the previous year, or maybe you could obviously argue that Napoli and Milan have continued to actually find ways to actually improve themselves and cultivate a very strong team. But Dumfries, of course, on a national team setup is someone who isn't rotatable. He is the more attacking fullback when you have Daley Blind, of course, playing left wing back at times, and even Malacia too, who we've seen play, I would say, quite a great defensive role at United at times, but of course does lack on the offense a little bit. Mala, of course, is someone who we see does play for Atalanta quite often, doesn't necessarily get the most amount of goals and assists, but when he plays with his Danish team, he does find absolute ways to flourish both as a left back and right back. So we have Mala, of course, who's really reasonably well priced as well at 4.5. So I really think he's going to be a steal here, specifically because this Danish team have found some great results as of late, even beating France 2-0. So their clean sheet potential is still there, and still, like the Euros, a great kind of differential team where we can look at great options. And we already have someone like Skov Olsen as well to cover that. In terms of the other defensive positions, I'd actually like to round out with a little bit of a punt here. I do like Estupiñán to actually start off with the group stages. He does have a tough game eventually in Matchday 2 because he does have to play Netherlands, and that's going to be a matchup. But you do have transfers as well to think about. And what I like about Estupiñán is simply that matchup versus Qatar. We can also look towards Ecuador's record of clean sheets as of late. They've gotten 5 clean sheets in the last few games. Yes, versus much easier opposition, but you'll also see that some teams within the group stages that have relatively easy games have also given away clean sheets versus some really, really weak teams. This is what happens on an international level. You have some surprise results, you have some high-scoring results, but Ecuador are a team that keep it very, very defensive. They don't even have much on offensive edge themselves, so they do pride themselves over playing a very, very resolute defensive game. And I do think Estupiñán even has the capacity to play a slight attacking role as the fullback of the team. Someone who, for example, like in his role with Brighton, as a bit more of a 65-minute, 70-minute attacking player in the left wing-back position, does provide a lot of attacking opportunities through both goal attempts and also just general chance creation with his crosses. So Estupiñán is someone who I'd like to pick because of how easy on paper the matchup versus Qatar is, because of how Qatar's overall weak international standing. On top of that too, I would actually like to round out this team with someone like Guardiola. And the reason why I'm actually going for Guardiola from the defense position and not going for another budget player from Croatia, you have the other option of Sosa as well, who's at 3.5 million, and he is the left back for Croatia, but he's not nailed in that position. You have other players who've been competing in the spot as well. Guardiola is someone who actually can play flexibly left back and centre back. He has always been playing for Croatia as a centre back position, and I do simply like how nailed he is. I don't really want to have the chance of someone like Sosa being rotated in match day 2, specifically when Estupiñán is someone who I probably have to transfer out. So I like the punt of Estupiñán, but I need the security of the clean sheets and the nailedness of Guardiola. And therefore, I think at 4 million to actually get a Croatian defender is actually a reasonably well priced to actually get him. And he's going to be my last defender for this draft, someone who's a bit more of a budget enabler once again. For the goalkeepers, the reason why I've actually omitted someone like a Cancelo is because I think Cancelo actually occupies the position of Dumfries. He, in this draft structure here, could replace Dumfries, but I think Joe Acosta is just so well priced for a Portuguese goalkeeper. If you actually look at some of the other defensive players, some of the goalkeepers as well, and their prices, you won't really see them at 5 million. He's probably the most well-priced keeper in the game, alongside someone like Rocher. And I think Rocher, of course, is probably the most well-priced 4 million goalkeeper in the game. He is someone who has started the most recent games for Uruguay, and I think he will be nailed as the keeper for the World Cup. Costa is someone who has asserted himself both on a Champions League level, a domestic level, and on an international level as Portugal's leading goalkeeping export, I would say. he is probably expected to actually lead Portugal in many years as one of the star keepers in world football. And I think he is one of those players where, because he's at 5 million and someone like Cancelo's at 6 million, and all the other Portuguese defenders who are expected to start are at 5.5, you have a much easier access towards this Portuguese team at a much cut rate price. When you compare it to the Netherlands team, right now we don't even have the keeper in the game, and I think Dumfries does provide that attacking edge. When we look at Cancelo and also Portugal, and we discussed them briefly, I would say they play much more defensive than a Man City would do on a domestic level. So that's going to be the main difference there. Whereas this Danish national team does incorporate Dumfries very, very offensively, and Cancelo, I would say, gets less of an offensive edge because he also has to change positions sometimes with whether they play Nuno Mendes, Rafael Guerreiro, or even Diogo Dalot. And we've even seen, I think, less goal involvements just simply for Cancelo within the Portuguese national setup compared to someone like a Dumfries as well. So I think that's going to be why I've gone for Dumfries here, and I've gone for Diogo Costa instead to actually cover that Portuguese defense and hedge a little bit there. With Rocher, you have someone who just simply is too well priced, I think. Playing for Uruguay, of course, in a very, very tough group, but at 4 million to actually have access to a reasonably top team in the tournament with a lot of players who are actually in form, specifically in the midfield position. More from the offensive edge, of course, with players like Valverde and Bentancur finding a lot of offensive form, but these are both players who are actually capable of playing defensively and attacking-wise for their teams and to actually bolster how strong that overall core is. And simply put, when you have some veteran players like Godin as well who are able to play within this Uruguay side, I do think it's a decent punt to actually go for at 4 million compared to some of the other keepers we have at our disposal. So this is going to be my team. It uses the full 100 million of our draft up. Of course, you can go for some variations of players, and I'll be actually recapping all the potential players and best options that I think exist at the midfield, forward, defensive, and even goalkeeping positions in the cheat sheet video very, very shortly. So do look out for that team selection guide. But for now, this is going to be my first team selection draft based on the available players that we have. And thank you guys so much for watching.